Picture this. You're standing at the edge of your village in 1347, staring down a muddy track that disappears into a wall of dark forest. Your leather purse contains 3 silver coins, a chunk of hard bread, and a letter that needs to reach Paris before Christmas. The problem? It's September. Paris is 200 miles away, and you've never been more than 10 miles from the place you were born. Welcome to medieval travel, where every journey was an adventure, every road was a gamble, and arriving alive was considered a minor miracle. Forget everything you think you know about getting from point A to point B. This isn't a world of highways, hotels, or GPS. This is a world where direction is determined by the sun. Distance is measured by days of walking, and the biggest navigation tool you have is asking strangers who may or may not be planning to rob you. Medieval travel wasn't just difficult. It was an act of faith, courage, and occasionally sheer desperation. The roads, if you could call them that, were barely controlled chaos carved into the landscape by centuries of feet, hooves, and wagon wheels. Most were simply dirt tracks that followed ancient Roman routes or meandered between settlements like drunken snakes. When it rained, which it did constantly, these roads transformed into rivers of mud so deep that wagons disappeared up to their axles and horses got stuck like flies in honey. When it was dry, which happened approximately 3 days a year, the roads became clouds of choking dust that coated travelers from head to toe in a fine layer of medieval grime. Road signs? Absolutely not. Maps? Those were reserved for kings and the occasional monk with time on his hands. Most travelers relied on crude directions passed from person to person like a game of medieval telephone. Go straight until you see the hanged man, then turn left at the burned village. If you reach the monastery with no roof, you've gone too far. It was navigation by landmark, and the landmarks were often distressingly morbid. The Romans had built magnificent stone highways that crisscrossed Europe, but by the Middle Ages, these engineering marvels had fallen into spectacular disrepair. What remained were crumbling sections interrupted by washouts, overgrown with weeds, and often torn up by locals who needed the stones for their own building projects. The famous Roman roads that once carried legions across continents now looked like ancient ruins being slowly digested by the earth. But here's the thing about medieval roads. They weren't just difficult to navigate. They were dangerous. Bandits haunted the forests, waiting for solitary travelers or poorly defended merchant caravans. Wild animals roamed freely. Wolves, bears, and boars saw humans as either threats or dinner, depending on their mood. The roads themselves were death traps filled with hidden holes, unstable bridges, and river crossings that could turn deadly with a single misstep. And then there were the tolls. Every bridge, every mountain pass, every reasonably maintained stretch of road came with a price. Local lords saw travelers as walking bags of money and erected toll booths with the enthusiasm of modern parking meter enforcers. Miss a payment or try to sneak around, and you'd find yourself in a medieval dungeon explaining your travel plans to someone with a questionable understanding of human rights. So when you set off on your journey to Paris, you weren't just leaving home. You were entering a world where every step forward was earned through the endurance, cunning, and an impressive tolerance for discomfort. The road ahead stretched like a test of character, and most people failed. Let's say you've decided to make your journey on foot, which was how most medieval people traveled. Walking wasn't just common, it was the default mode of transportation for anyone who wasn't wealthy enough to own a horse or foolish enough to trust their life to a cart on wheels. Medieval walking, however, wasn't the leisurely stroll through countryside you might imagine. It was a grueling endurance test that turned every mile into a small victory. Your shoes, assuming you had any, were basically leather bags tied around your feet. They offered about as much support as wet lettuce and wore through faster than your patience. Most were made from a single piece of hide, stitched together with the kind of craftsmanship you'd expect from someone who learned their trade during a particularly devastating plague year. The soles were thin enough that you could feel every pebble, root, and unfortunate sharp object on the road. After a few days of walking, your feet would be a patchwork of blisters, cuts, and general misery. Medieval clothing wasn't designed for travel. Your woolen tunic might be warm, but it was also heavy, scratchy, and absorbed moisture like a sponge. When it rained, which it did constantly, your clothes became waterlogged and stayed wet for days. The extra weight made walking even more exhausting, and the wet fabric chafed against your skin until you developed raw patches that made every step agony. Your cloak, meant to provide protection from the elements, was more like wearing a wet blanket that someone had thoughtfully filled with small rocks. The pace of medieval travel was brutally slow. A healthy person on foot could cover about 20 miles a day on good roads under perfect conditions. But perfect conditions were about as common as honest tax collectors. Bad weather, poor roads, illness, or simply the need to rest could cut that distance in half. Most travelers planned their journeys in stages, hoping to reach a village, monastery, or inn before nightfall. Being caught on the road after dark wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially fatal. Food and water were constant concerns. You carried what you could, which wasn't much. A leather pouch might hold some dried bread, a chunk of cheese if you were lucky, and maybe some nuts or dried fruit. Water was gathered from streams, wells, or rivers along the way, assuming they weren't contaminated with the runoff from the nearest village's waste. Medieval travelers developed iron stomachs out of necessity, learning to eat whatever was available and drink whatever water they could find without dying immediately. The weather was your most unpredictable enemy. Medieval Europe was in the grip of what historians call the Little Ice Age, making winters longer, colder, and more brutal than anything we experience today. Summer rain could turn roads into impassable swamps. Winter snow could bury them entirely. Spring flooding could wash out bridges and turn gentle streams into raging torrents. And autumn storms could arrive without warning, leaving travelers stranded in the open with nothing but their inadequate clothing for protection. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of walking long distances in the Middle Ages was the sheer monotony of it. Day after day of putting one foot in front of the other, watching the same endless stretch of rutted road unfold ahead of you. No podcasts, no music, no audiobooks, just the sound of your own labored breathing, the squelch of mud under your feet, and the occasional conversation with fellow travelers who were probably just as tired and miserable as you were. Walking to Paris wasn't a journey. It was a pilgrimage of endurance, a test of just how much discomfort a human being could endure in pursuit of reaching their destination. And every step reminded you that in the medieval world, distance wasn't measured in miles or kilometers. It was measured in suffering. If you were wealthy enough to afford a horse, congratulations. You'd just upgraded from walking torture to mounted torture. Horses were expensive, temperamental, and required constant care, but they were also the medieval equivalent of a luxury car. They could cover more ground in a day than a person on foot, assuming they didn't go lame, get sick, or decide to throw you into a ditch for looking at them wrong. Medieval horses weren't the sleek, well-bred animals you see in movies. Most were sturdy, compact creatures that looked more like modern ponies than the majestic war horses of legend. They were bred for endurance rather than speed, capable of carrying a rider and supplies over long distances without collapsing. But they were also expensive to maintain. A horse needed food, water, shelter, and regular care from someone who knew what they were doing. For most medieval people, owning a horse was like owning a small airplane. Technically possible, but financially ruinous. Riding a medieval horse wasn't comfortable. Stirrups had been invented, but saddles were often just leather pads stuffed with straw or wool. After a few hours in the saddle, your back ached, your legs cramped, and certain parts of your anatomy felt like they'd been tenderized with a medieval mallet. Most riders developed a distinctive bow-legged gait from spending days on horseback, walking like cowboys who'd forgotten how to use their legs properly. Horses also had opinions about travel routes. They might refuse to cross certain streams, balk at muddy roads, or simply decide they'd had enough walking for one day and plant themselves in the middle of the road like furry, stubborn boulders. Medieval travelers developed a deep understanding of horse psychology, learning to read their mount's moods and adjust their plans accordingly. A tired or frightened horse could turn a simple journey into an exercise in frustration that lasted for hours. Feeding your horse was a constant concern. Unlike modern horses that eat processed grain and hay, medieval horses grazed on whatever grass they could find or ate whatever their owners could afford to buy. Inn stables charged for food and shelter, adding to the cost of travel. Poor quality feed could make a horse sick, and a sick horse meant your journey stopped until it recovered or died. Many travelers carried basic veterinary supplies, not because they were experts, but because finding a qualified horse doctor in the middle of nowhere was about as likely as finding a working smartphone. The bond between medieval travelers and their horses was often intense. Your horse wasn't just transportation, it was your survival. It carried your supplies, protected you from bandits who might think twice about attacking a mounted rider, and provided companionship during long, lonely stretches of road. Losing your horse to illness, injury, or theft could strand you hundreds of miles from home with no way to continue your journey. Wealthy travelers sometimes rode in groups with spare horses, servants, and guards, but most horse owners were merchants, messengers, or minor nobles traveling alone, or with a single companion. They learned to care for their animals with the dedication of modern car enthusiasts, checking hooves for stones, watching for signs of lameness, and treating their horses like the valuable, temperamental machines they were. Riding to Paris wasn't faster just because you had a horse. It was faster because you could cover more ground when conditions were good, carry more supplies, and avoid some of the dangers that faced travelers on foot. But it also meant worrying about an additional living creature whose health and mood could determine whether your journey succeeded or ended in disaster somewhere between your starting point and your destination. For the truly wealthy or important, travel could involve a wagon or cart, which sounds luxurious until you realize that medieval vehicles were essentially wooden torture devices designed by people who had clearly never ridden in one. Wagons were built for cargo, not comfort. They had no springs, no shock absorbers, and no consideration for the human spine. Sitting in a medieval cart was like riding in a wooden box being dragged over a landscape of rocks, roots, and randomly placed craters. The wheels were solid wood bound with iron, designed to last rather than provide a smooth ride. Every bump, pothole, and uneven stone was transmitted directly through the wooden chassis to the passengers with the efficiency of a medieval vibrating chair. After a few hours, your teeth rattled, your bones ached, and you began to understand why walking was sometimes preferable to riding in style. Medieval carts came in various forms, from simple two-wheeled affairs pulled by oxen to elaborate four-wheeled carriages drawn by teams of horses. Oxen were slow but reliable, plodding along at a steady pace that could cover significant distances without rest. Horses were faster but more expensive and required better care. The choice usually came down to how much money you had and how quickly you needed to reach your destination. The cargo space in these vehicles was shared between people and supplies. Wealthy travelers might have cushions, blankets, and portable furniture to make the journey more bearable. But most passengers sat on wooden benches or simply found space among the sacks of grain, barrels of ale, and other goods being transported. Privacy was non-existent, comfort was minimal, and dignity was often the first casualty of medieval transportation. Weather was the enemy of cart travel. Rain turned roads into muddy swamps that could trap wheels and exhaust animals. Snow and ice made travel impossible. Strong winds could overturn top-heavy vehicles, and lightning storms sent horses into panics that could result in runaway carts careening across the countryside like medieval missiles. Smart travelers checked the sky constantly and adjusted their plans based on what they saw in the clouds. Mechanical problems were frequent and catastrophic. Broken wheels, snapped axles, and harness failures could strand a cart in the middle of nowhere. Medieval travelers carried basic repair tools and materials, but fixing a broken wagon often required the skills of a carpenter, blacksmith, and veterinarian rolled into one. Finding help in remote areas meant sending someone on foot to the nearest village and hoping they could find craftsmen willing to make emergency repairs. Bandits saw wagons as attractive targets. A cart full of goods and wealthy passengers was like a medieval lottery ticket, and highway robbery was a career choice for many desperate men. Wagon trains sometimes traveled together for protection, hiring guards or coordinating with local authorities for safe passage through dangerous areas. But isolated carts were vulnerable to attack, and losing your transportation often meant losing everything you owned. The social dynamics of cart travel were complex. Passengers from different social classes shared space but maintained strict hierarchies. Nobles expected deference, merchants discussed business, and common travelers tried to stay invisible. Arguments over space, food, and travel decisions were common, especially during long journeys when nerves frayed and patience wore thin. The wooden walls of a medieval cart could contain weeks of accumulated tension, frustration, and barely suppressed violence. Traveling by cart to Paris meant accepting that your journey would be slow, uncomfortable, and expensive, but also recognizing that you'd arrive with your possessions intact and your feet in better condition than if you'd walked. It was a trade-off between speed and comfort, money and convenience, and for those who could afford it, carts represented the closest thing to luxury travel that the medieval world could provide. When darkness fell on medieval roads, the world transformed from merely dangerous to actively hostile. Traveling at night wasn't just discouraged, it was essentially suicidal. The roads that were difficult to navigate during the day became invisible death traps after sunset. Without streetlights, road markers, or any form of artificial illumination, travelers were left to stumble through landscapes that might as well have been alien planets. The darkness wasn't just an inconvenience, it was complete. Medieval nights were darker than anything modern people experience. No city lights, no car headlights, no electric glow on the horizon. When clouds covered the moon, the world disappeared into an absolute blackness that could disorient even experienced travelers within minutes. People got lost a few feet from main roads, wandering in circles until dawn, or until they fell into streams, ditches, or other hazards they couldn't see coming. Most medieval travelers planned their journeys around finding shelter before nightfall. This meant stopping at villages, monasteries, inns, or the homes of friends and relatives. The medieval day ended when the sun set, not because people were lazy, but because continuing to travel in darkness was a form of medieval Russian roulette. Smart travelers started looking for accommodation hours before sunset, knowing that being picky about lodging was a luxury they couldn't afford. Monasteries were often the safest bet for overnight shelter. Medieval monasteries were required by their religious obligations to provide hospitality to travelers, offering basic food and shelter to anyone who requested it. The accommodations were sparse, usually a spot on the floor of a communal dormitory, but they were clean, safe, and free. Monks also provided valuable information about road conditions, weather, and local dangers that could save a traveler's life. Village inns, when they existed, offered more comfort, but at a price. These establishments were often little more than enlarged peasant houses, with a few extra rooms and a kitchen that could feed guests. The quality ranged from merely uncomfortable to actively dangerous. Some innkeepers were honest business people providing a valuable service. Others were in league with local bandits, drugging guests' drinks and robbing them while they slept. Choosing the wrong inn could turn a restful night into a final night. The sleeping arrangements at medieval inns were communal and intimate. Guests shared beds with strangers, often sleeping 3 or 4 to a mattress that was already too small for one person. Privacy was non-existent, security was minimal, and hygiene was optional. Fleas, lice, and bed bugs were permanent residents of most inn mattresses, treating guests like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Many travelers chose to sleep on the floor rather than share a bed with insects and strangers of questionable character. Food at inns was basic and often suspect. Stews of unknown origin, bread that might be days old, and ale that could range from merely flat to actively poisonous. Travelers learned to eat whatever was offered without asking too many questions about ingredients or preparation methods. The alternative was going hungry, and hungry travelers made poor decisions that could get them killed. For those caught on the road after dark, the options were limited and dangerous. Some tried to continue traveling by moonlight, feeling their way along familiar roads and hoping to reach their destination before dawn. Others found whatever shelter they could, sleeping under trees, in abandoned buildings, or in the open air. These makeshift camps were vulnerable to wild animals, bandits, and weather that could turn deadly without warning. The sounds of medieval nights were unsettling. Wolves howling in the distance, the scream of unknown animals, the rustle of creatures moving through undergrowth, and the occasional human sounds that could indicate either fellow travelers or potential threats. Medieval people developed acute hearing, learning to identify dangerous sounds and respond appropriately. A snapping twig could mean a deer or a bandit, and the wrong assumption could be fatal. Finding shelter for the night wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Medieval travel stopped when the sun set because continuing in darkness was like playing a game where the stakes were your life and the odds were stacked against you. Smart travelers planned their journeys around available shelter, accepting that their schedule was dictated by the sun and the availability of safe places to sleep. The people you encountered on medieval roads were as varied and unpredictable as the roads themselves. Every journey was a social experiment, throwing together merchants and pilgrims, nobles and peasants, honest travelers and dangerous criminals in an ever-changing cast of characters who shared the common experience of being far from home and at the mercy of the road. Pilgrims were the most common travelers, walking or riding to holy sites like Canterbury, Rome, or Santiago de Compostela. They were identifiable by their distinctive clothing, staff, and religious badges that showed which shrines they'd visited. Pilgrims were generally considered safe traveling companions, bound by religious obligations to help fellow travelers, and usually carrying little wealth worth stealing. They shared news from distant places, knew the locations of monasteries and shrines, and often had valuable information about road conditions ahead. Merchants formed the backbone of medieval travel, carrying goods between towns and cities in carefully planned routes that balanced profit against risk. They traveled in groups when possible, hiring guards and coordinating with other traders for protection against bandits. Merchants were walking encyclopedias of practical travel knowledge, knowing which inns were safe, which roads were dangerous, and which local officials could be bribed or negotiated with. They also carried the most interesting cargo, from exotic spices and silks to books and musical instruments. Messengers and royal couriers moved with speed and purpose, carrying letters, documents, and news between courts, cities, and important individuals. They were often well-mounted and well-armed, traveling alone or with small escorts to maintain speed and secrecy. Messengers were valuable sources of current news and political gossip, but they were also secretive about their cargo and destinations. Some carried sensitive information that could get them killed if it fell into the wrong hands. Nobles traveling with their retinues were mobile displays of wealth and power, surrounded by servants, guards, and enough luggage to supply a small army. They moved slowly but safely, their presence on the road both a protection and a target. Common travelers could benefit from joining a noble's party for protection, but they also risked being caught up in political conflicts and noble feuds that could turn violent without warning. Wandering scholars, minstrels, and entertainers added color to medieval roads, carrying news, songs, and stories between settlements. They were usually poor, but welcomed everywhere for their entertainment value. These travelers were living libraries, preserving and transmitting culture across vast distances. They knew the gossip from multiple kingdoms, the latest songs and stories, and often had connections in cities and courts that could prove valuable to fellow travelers. But not everyone on medieval roads was harmless. Bandits disguised themselves as legitimate travelers, joining groups before revealing their true intentions at opportune moments. Desperate people driven from their homes by war, famine, or disease sometimes turned to highway robbery as a survival strategy. Professional criminals operated along busy trade routes, using inside information from corrupt innkeepers and local contacts to identify and target wealthy travelers. The social dynamics of medieval travel groups were complex and constantly shifting. Temporary alliances formed for mutual protection, dissolved over personality conflicts or different destinations, and reformed with new members as circumstances changed. Trust was earned slowly and lost quickly. A traveling companion who seemed friendly and helpful during the day might disappear with your horse and supplies during the night. Religious and social hierarchies persisted on the road, but they were also challenged by the equalizing effects of shared hardship. A noble might demand deference, but if he couldn't keep up with the group or contribute to common defense, his authority meant little. Peasants who knew local roads and conditions became valuable guides, regardless of their social status. The road created its own temporary society, with its own rules and power structures. Women travelers were rare and faced additional dangers. Most traveled in groups with family members or under the protection of religious institutions. Solo female travelers were viewed with suspicion and faced constant threats of violence and exploitation. Some disguised themselves as men or sought protection by joining pilgrim groups or merchant caravans. The medieval road was a masculine environment where women survived through careful planning, disguise, or the protection of others. Meeting other travelers was always a moment of calculation and risk assessment. Were they friendly or dangerous? Could they be trusted? Did they have valuable information or useful skills? Were they potential allies or potential threats? Medieval travelers developed sophisticated social skills, learning to read people quickly and accurately because their lives often depended on these judgments. The road was a social laboratory where normal rules didn't always apply, where temporary communities formed and dissolved, and where every encounter was a story waiting to be told in the taverns and markets of distant cities. Rivers were the highways of medieval Europe, but they were highways with teeth. Every major river carried commercial traffic, passenger boats, and cargo vessels, but they also carried dangers that could turn a peaceful voyage into a nightmare. Medieval river travel was faster than walking, and sometimes safer than roads, but it came with its own unique set of challenges and terrors. Medieval boats were simple, practical vessels designed for cargo rather than comfort. Most were flat-bottomed barges that could navigate shallow waters and carry heavy loads. Passenger accommodations were minimal, often consisting of space on deck between cargo or cramped quarters below deck that smelled like a combination of tar, fish, and human misery. The boats were built for function, not comfort, and passengers were often an afterthought in vessel design. Boatmen were a rough breed, skilled in navigation, but not particularly concerned with passenger comfort or safety. They knew every current, sandbar, and hidden obstacle on their sections of river. But they also had a reputation for drinking, gambling, and occasional piracy. Many were honest professionals providing valuable transportation services, but others saw passengers as potential victims or sources of additional income through creative interpretation of agreed-upon fares. River currents could be treacherous and unpredictable. Spring floods turned gentle streams into raging torrents that could smash boats against rocks or carry them miles off course. Summer droughts left rivers too shallow for navigation, stranding boats on sandbars until rain returned. Winter ice made rivers impassable for months, freezing boats into the water until spring thaws. Weather conditions could change rapidly, turning a calm voyage into a fight for survival. Rapids and waterfalls required skilled navigation and sometimes portaging, where the entire boat and its cargo had to be carried overland around dangerous sections of river. This process was slow, expensive, and dangerous, requiring coordination between crew and passengers. Many boats were damaged or destroyed during portaging, stranding travelers in remote areas with limited options for continuing their journey. Pirates and river bandits operated along major waterways, using hidden coves and tributaries to launch surprise attacks on merchant vessels and passenger boats. Some worked alone from small, fast boats that could overtake larger vessels. Others operated from fortified positions along riverbanks, demanding tolls or simply attacking any boat that passed within range. River pirates were often local men who knew the waterways intimately and could disappear into complex networks of streams and marshes. Bridge crossings were expensive and often controlled by local lords who charged tolls for passage. Some bridges were well maintained and reasonably safe, but others were rickety structures that swayed in the wind and threatened to collapse under the weight of a loaded cart. Many travelers chose to pay ferrymen to cross rivers rather than risk their lives on suspect bridges, but ferries came with their own dangers and costs. Navigating rivers required local knowledge that most travelers didn't possess. Channels shifted with seasonal floods. Sandbars appeared and disappeared, and safe passages could become deadly traps without warning. Experienced river pilots were valuable guides, but they charged accordingly for their expertise. Travelers who tried to navigate unfamiliar rivers without local help often found themselves lost, stranded, or worse. Weather was a constant concern for river travelers. Sudden storms could swamp small boats or drive them into dangerous waters. Fog could make navigation impossible, forcing boats to anchor and wait for clear weather. Wind could drive boats off course or make rowing impossible. Lightning storms were particularly dangerous for travelers on open water with nowhere to take shelter. The rhythm of river travel was different from road travel. Instead of the steady pace of walking or riding, river travel involved periods of fast movement, followed by delays for obstacles, weather, or navigation challenges. Passengers had to be flexible with their schedules, accepting that arrival times were estimates rather than guarantees. River travel could be peaceful and beautiful, offering views of countryside that were impossible to see from roads. The gentle motion of boats could be relaxing, and the absence of bumps and jolts made it easier than cart travel for some passengers. But it also meant surrendering control to forces beyond human influence: current, weather, and the skill and honesty of the boat crew. For travelers heading to Paris, rivers like the Seine offered direct routes that could save days or weeks compared to overland travel. But they also required careful planning, reliable boatmen, and the ability to adapt to conditions that could change without warning. Medieval river travel was efficient when everything went right, and potentially fatal when it didn't. Medieval cities were islands of civilization in a sea of wilderness, but they were also walls that marked the end of one set of dangers and the beginning of another. Entering a city like Paris meant leaving behind the hazards of the road, but it also meant navigating the complex social, political, and economic networks that governed urban life. Cities had their own rules, their own dangers, and their own opportunities for the unwary traveler. City gates were the first challenge for arriving travelers. Medieval cities were surrounded by walls designed to keep out armies, bandits, and undesirable visitors. Guards at the gates decided who could enter, often demanding tolls, inspecting cargo, and questioning travelers about their business in the city. Suspicious travelers could be turned away, arrested, or subjected to lengthy interrogations. Having proper documentation, letters of introduction, or known contacts in the city could make the difference between quick entry and being stranded outside the walls. Once inside the city, travelers faced a maze of narrow, twisting streets that seemed designed to confuse outsiders. Medieval cities grew organically rather than according to any master plan, resulting in neighborhoods that sprawled in all directions without apparent logic. Street signs were rare, and navigation depended on landmarks like churches, markets, and public buildings. Getting lost was easy, and finding your destination often required asking directions from locals who might or might not be helpful. City accommodations ranged from luxury to squalor, often within the same neighborhood. Wealthy travelers could find comfortable lodgings at established inns near the city center, complete with private rooms, decent meals, and secure stables for their horses. Poor travelers competed for space in crowded hostels, taverns, and boarding houses where privacy was non-existent, and safety was never guaranteed. Some cities had designated areas for different types of travelers, with separate quarters for merchants, pilgrims, and foreign visitors. Urban crime was sophisticated and well organized. City thieves were professionals who specialized in separating travelers from their money, possessions, and sometimes their lives. Pickpockets worked crowded markets and festivals. Cut purses targeted wealthy visitors in expensive neighborhoods, and gangs operated protection rackets that forced travelers to pay for safe passage through certain areas. Rural bandits were direct and brutal, but city criminals were subtle and calculating. Markets were the heart of medieval cities, offering goods and services that were impossible to find in smaller settlements. Travelers could buy supplies, sell goods they'd carried from distant places, and gather information about conditions in other regions. But markets were also chaotic, dangerous places where quality was inconsistent, prices were negotiable, and fraud was common. Experienced travelers learned to inspect goods carefully, negotiate prices aggressively, and watch for short-changing and other common scams. City authorities were complex bureaucracies with their own agendas and corruption. Mayors, guild leaders, church officials, and royal representatives all had overlapping jurisdictions and conflicting interests. Travelers who ran afoul of one authority might find protection with another, but they could also become caught in political conflicts that had nothing to do with their original business. Understanding urban politics was essential for anyone planning an extended stay in a medieval city. Guilds controlled most urban trades and crafts, creating monopolies that regulated prices, quality, and access to goods and services. Travelers who needed specialized services like metalwork, textiles, or transportation had to deal with guild regulations and pricing. Some guilds were helpful to travelers, providing quality services at fair prices. Others were exploitative, taking advantage of visitors who had no alternatives. Urban sanitation was better than rural conditions, but still challenging by modern standards. Cities had public latrines, waste disposal systems, and sometimes running water. But they also had higher population densities that created new health hazards. Disease spread quickly through crowded neighborhoods, especially during summer months when heat and humidity created ideal conditions for epidemics. Travelers arriving from rural areas often lacked immunity to urban diseases and could become seriously ill within days of entering a city. Social dynamics in cities were more complex than in rural areas. Cities contained multiple social classes, ethnic groups, and religious communities living in close proximity. Travelers had to navigate these relationships carefully, understanding which neighborhoods were safe, which customs were important, and which people could be trusted. Urban society offered opportunities for advancement and enrichment, but it also contained hidden dangers for the unprepared. Religious institutions played important roles in urban life, providing services to travelers and residents alike. Churches offered sanctuary, monasteries provided hospitality, and religious festivals created opportunities for business and social interaction. But religious conflicts were also more intense in cities, where different groups competed for influence and resources. Travelers could find themselves caught in theological disputes that had practical consequences for their safety and success. Entertainment in medieval cities was more varied and sophisticated than in rural areas. Taverns offered music, dancing, and gambling, while theaters and festivals provided elaborate shows and spectacles. But urban entertainment also attracted criminal elements and created situations where travelers could lose money, possessions, or reputation through poor choices or bad luck. Arriving in Paris after weeks or months of travel was both a relief and a new challenge. The city offered safety, comfort, and opportunities that were impossible to find on the road, but it also demanded different skills and knowledge for successful navigation. Medieval cities were destinations worth reaching, but they were also complex environments that required careful preparation and constant vigilance to navigate successfully. The cost of medieval travel was enough to bankrupt most people before they'd gone 50 miles. Everything associated with travel, from food and lodging to transportation and protection, came with a price tag that reflected the dangerous, difficult nature of medieval journeys. For most people, travel was a once-in-a-lifetime expense that required years of saving and careful financial planning. Transportation costs varied dramatically depending on the method chosen. Walking was free, but required significant investment in shoes, clothing, and supplies that would withstand weeks of hard use. A decent pair of leather shoes might cost a peasant a month's wages, and they would need to be replaced or extensively repaired during a long journey. Horses were exponentially more expensive, with the initial purchase price representing several years of income for most people. Maintaining a horse during travel added daily costs for food, shelter, and care that could quickly exceed the original investment. Food and lodging expenses accumulated daily and could consume a traveler's entire budget if not carefully managed. Inn prices were often inflated in areas with limited accommodation options, and innkeepers had little incentive to offer fair prices to travelers who had no alternatives. Monastery hospitality was free, but often included expectations of donations that could strain a traveler's finances. Camping in the open air saved money, but increased risks that could result in loss of possessions or life. Tolls and taxes were unavoidable expenses that appeared at every bridge, mountain pass, and city gate. Local lords and officials treated travelers as mobile sources of revenue, imposing fees that ranged from reasonable to extortionate. These costs were unpredictable and could change without warning based on local politics, economic conditions, or the whims of whoever controlled the collection points. Travelers had to carry extra money specifically for tolls and bribes, money that couldn't be spent on necessities. Security costs were sometimes necessary for safe passage through dangerous areas. Hiring guards, joining merchant caravans, or paying protection money to local authorities added significantly to travel expenses. These costs were essentially insurance premiums against robbery, violence, and death, but they were also sometimes scams operated by the very people claiming to provide protection. Emergency expenses could destroy even the most careful travel budget. Illness, injury, or equipment failure often required immediate expenditures for medical care, repairs, or replacement supplies. Being robbed meant not only losing possessions but also having to replace essential items before continuing the journey. Weather delays could extend trips by weeks, multiplying accommodation and food costs beyond original estimates. Currency exchange was another hidden cost that trapped unwary travelers. Medieval Europe was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and city-states, each with its own coinage and exchange rates. Silver pennies from one kingdom might be worth less in another, and some coins were rejected entirely in certain regions. Money changers operated near borders and in major cities, but they charged substantial fees for their services and often used exchange rates that favored them over travelers. Carrying valuable goods instead of coins could avoid some exchange problems, but it also made travelers targets for thieves and added weight and bulk to their luggage. Letters of credit were available to wealthy merchants and nobles, allowing them to deposit money in one city and withdraw it in another through the networks of bankers and money lenders. These early banking systems charged fees for their services, but offered security that was impossible with cash. However, most travelers were too poor to access these services and had to carry their wealth in coins, gems, or valuable goods that could be stolen or lost. The economic impact of travel extended beyond individual costs to affect entire families and communities. When a merchant embarked on a trading journey, his family often invested their savings in goods and supplies, gambling their financial future on his successful return. Failed journeys could impoverish multiple generations, while successful ones could elevate families to higher social and economic status. Villages sometimes pooled resources to send representatives to distant markets or religious sites, viewing travel as a community investment rather than an individual expense. Seasonal variations in travel costs created additional financial challenges. Spring and summer travel was more expensive because demand was higher and conditions were better. Winter travel was cheaper but more dangerous, with higher risks of failure that could result in total loss of investment. Harvest seasons affected food prices, religious festivals influenced accommodation availability, and political conflicts could suddenly make certain routes expensive or impossible to use. Travel insurance didn't exist in any formal sense, but medieval people developed informal systems for managing travel risks. Merchant guilds sometimes provided mutual aid to members who suffered losses during trade journeys. Religious organizations offered assistance to pilgrims who encountered difficulties. Family networks and business partnerships shared costs and risks among multiple parties. These systems helped distribute the financial burden of travel, but they also created complex obligations and dependencies that could last for years. The true cost of medieval travel wasn't just financial. It was measured in time away from family and work, health risks that could result in permanent disability or death, and opportunity costs of resources that couldn't be used for other purposes. For most medieval people, travel was an investment that required careful calculation of costs, benefits, and risks. The decision to travel was never made lightly, and the financial burden often extended far beyond the journey itself. Women who traveled in the medieval period faced a unique set of challenges that went far beyond the standard dangers of roads, weather, and bandits. Medieval society viewed female travelers with suspicion, and women who ventured beyond their local communities were often assumed to be either pilgrims on religious missions or women of questionable morality. The social constraints placed on women made travel not just difficult, but potentially reputation-destroying. Respectable women rarely traveled alone. Those who did were often widows with specific business to conduct, such as managing inherited property or pursuing legal matters that required their personal presence. Even then, they typically hired male escorts or joined larger traveling groups for protection. The presence of a male guardian was almost essential for safe passage, not just for physical protection, but for social legitimacy that could mean the difference between respectful treatment and harassment. Female pilgrims formed a significant portion of medieval travelers, seeking healing at religious shrines or fulfilling vows made during illness or childbirth. These women often traveled in organized pilgrim groups that provided both safety and social acceptance for their journeys. Religious travel was one of the few socially acceptable reasons for women to venture far from home, but it still carried risks and required careful planning to maintain propriety. Dress and appearance were crucial considerations for female travelers. Women had to balance modesty with practicality, wearing clothing that wouldn't attract unwanted attention while still providing protection from weather and road conditions. Wealthy women traveling with retinues could maintain elaborate wardrobes, but most female travelers adopted simpler, more practical clothing that wouldn't immediately identify them as targets for robbery or worse. Accommodation presented particular challenges for women. Inn-rooms were often shared spaces where privacy was minimal and safety was questionable. Women traveling alone sometimes slept in stables or common rooms rather than accept private lodging that could compromise their reputations or safety. Monasteries that provided hospitality to male travelers often had limited or no facilities for women, forcing female travelers to seek alternative accommodations or continue traveling to find suitable shelter. The threat of sexual violence was a constant concern that affected every aspect of female travel. Women developed strategies for protection that included disguising their gender, traveling only during daylight hours, and avoiding isolated areas where they might be vulnerable to attack. Some carried weapons or learned basic self-defense, but their options were limited by social expectations and physical realities. Economic constraints affected female travelers differently than men. Women generally had less access to money and fewer opportunities to earn income during travel. Those who did travel for business purposes, such as widowed merchants or artisans, often faced discrimination and exploitation that increased their costs and reduced their profits. The economic vulnerability of female travelers made them targets for various forms of abuse and exploitation. Legal protections for women varied significantly across different regions and jurisdictions. In some areas, crimes against female travelers were taken seriously and punished severely. In others, women had little recourse if they were robbed, cheated, or assaulted. Understanding local laws and customs was essential for female travelers, but information was often difficult to obtain and could change without notice. Despite these challenges, medieval women did travel, sometimes extensively. Merchants' wives and daughters participated in family trading ventures, noble women traveled between estates and courts, and religious women made pilgrimages that took them across continents. These female travelers developed networks of contacts and support systems that helped subsequent generations of women navigate the challenges of medieval travel. The experiences of female travelers were rarely recorded in detail, as most medieval chronicles and travel accounts were written by and about men. The stories that do survive reveal women who were resourceful, determined, and capable of overcoming extraordinary obstacles to achieve their travel goals. Their journeys required not just physical courage, but social courage to defy expectations and venture into spaces that society considered inappropriate for women. By the time you finally reached Paris, limping through the city gates with worn shoes, travel-stained clothes, and a considerably lighter purse, you had accomplished something remarkable. You had survived medieval travel, an achievement that placed you among a small percentage of people who dared to venture beyond their local communities and lived to tell about it. The city that greeted you was a revelation after weeks or months on primitive roads. Paris in the 14th century was one of Europe's largest cities, home to perhaps 200,000 people who had somehow managed to cram themselves into a space that seemed impossibly crowded after the empty landscapes you'd crossed to get there. The noise was overwhelming. Church bells, street vendors, animals, and the constant chatter of people speaking in dialects and languages you might never have heard before. The smell was equally intense, but different from the rural odors you'd grown accustomed to during your journey. Paris smelled of cooking food, human waste, wood smoke, and the distinctive urban aroma of too many people living too close together. After weeks of breathing forest air and open sky, the city atmosphere felt thick and oppressive. But it also smelled of civilization, commerce, and opportunity. Your first priority was finding accommodation that you could afford, and that wouldn't result in you being robbed, murdered, or worse during your first night in the city. The quality of lodging available to travelers ranged from luxurious inns frequented by wealthy merchants and nobles to squalid hostels where sleeping space was rented by the night and privacy was non-existent. Your choice would depend on how much money you had left after your journey and how particular you could afford to be about your comfort and safety. The people of Paris were as varied as the buildings that housed them. Street vendors hawked everything from hot pies to religious relics, their calls blending into a constant din of commercial activity. Apprentices hurried through the streets carrying tools and materials for their masters. Nobles rode through the crowds in elaborate processions that forced everyone else to press against walls and into doorways. Priests, monks, and nuns moved with purpose between churches and monasteries. Beggars, pickpockets, and prostitutes worked the crowds with professional efficiency. Conducting business in Paris required understanding the complex web of guilds, authorities, and regulations that governed urban commerce. If you had goods to sell, you needed to know which markets were appropriate for your merchandise, what taxes and fees were required, and which officials needed to be satisfied before you could legally conduct business. If you needed services, you had to navigate guild monopolies that controlled everything from metalworking to transportation. The legal system in Paris was as complex as its commercial networks. Different areas of the city fell under different jurisdictions, with the church courts, royal courts, and municipal authorities all claiming authority over various types of disputes and crimes. Understanding which court had jurisdiction over your particular situation could mean the difference between justice and disaster. Foreigners and travelers were particularly vulnerable to legal complications because they lacked local knowledge and connections. Information was both abundant and unreliable in a city like Paris. Taverns and markets buzzed with news, rumors, and gossip from across Europe. But separating fact from fiction required experience and judgment that most travelers lacked. Political news could be particularly dangerous, as expressing the wrong opinion or repeating the wrong rumor could result in arrest or worse. Smart travelers learned to listen more than they spoke and to avoid discussions of sensitive topics. The cultural shock of arriving in a major medieval city was profound for travelers from rural areas. The diversity of people, languages, customs, and religions created a sensory overload that could be both exciting and terrifying. Urban social dynamics were more complex than anything most travelers had experienced, with subtle hierarchies and relationships that could take months or years to understand fully. Your journey to Paris was finally complete, but in many ways your real adventure was just beginning. The city offered opportunities for trade, learning, and advancement that were impossible to find in smaller communities, but it also presented new challenges and dangers that required different skills and knowledge to navigate successfully. The road had tested your physical endurance and survival skills. The city would test your intelligence, adaptability, and social skills in ways that were equally demanding. Medieval travel was not for the faint of heart. It was a brutal test of human endurance, resourcefulness, and determination that separated the truly committed from those who preferred the safety and comfort of staying home. Every mile was earned through sweat, every destination reached through perseverance, and every safe arrival was a small miracle in an age when the world beyond your village was genuinely dangerous and unpredictable. The modern world has sanitized travel into a comfortable, predictable experience, where the greatest dangers are flight delays and overpriced airport food. Medieval travelers faced real risks of death, disability, and financial ruin with every journey they undertook. Their willingness to venture into this dangerous world speaks to a courage and determination that we can barely imagine today. Yet they traveled anyway. Merchants crossed continents to trade in exotic goods. Pilgrims walked thousands of miles to visit holy sites. Scholars journeyed between universities to share knowledge. Diplomats carried messages between kingdoms. Ordinary people left their homes to seek opportunities, adventure, or simply to satisfy their curiosity about the world beyond their immediate experience. Their stories remind us that travel has always been one of humanity's most powerful drives, strong enough to overcome almost any obstacle. The medieval travelers who struggled along muddy roads, slept in bug-infested inns, and faced dangers we can barely comprehend were driven by the same impulses that motivate modern travelers: the desire to see new places, meet new people, and experience the incredible diversity of human culture and achievement. In our age of easy travel, when we can cross oceans in hours and continents in days, it's worth remembering what travel once required. Medieval travelers earned every mile through suffering and sacrifice, but they also experienced the world with an intensity and appreciation that our comfortable modern journeys rarely provide. Their struggles remind us that the value of travel isn't just in reaching your destination, but in being changed by the journey itself.